All right. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us today from other time zones. We are so happy to have you here today for our second webinar in our three-part webinar series. Today, we are going to discuss the top 10 program review audit findings in order according to the Department of Education for fiscal year 2022. I do want to mention that this presentation is updated for the fiscal year 2022, and it is very regulatory heavy with a lot of references today to the FSA handbook and other Department of Education materials. But before we get started, I do want to introduce myself to you. I've been in the financial aid profession for 16 plus years, almost 17, and 14 years of that I've served as a financial aid director. I've worked as a director of financial aid in our community colleges, public and private institutions. And today I'm really excited to talk to you about the common audit findings are and steps to implement processes to avoid them. All right, so before we get started, I want to go over the learning objectives for today. We are going to summarize the top-cited audit findings within student financial aid, specifically the top program review findings for fiscal year 2022. We're going to define each finding in detail and learn ways to correct them, and then discuss questions from other higher education institutions and what the best practices and answers to avoid those findings at your institution. All right, so we're going to start off this morning by mentioning administrative capability and what that means for an institution. We're going to dive deeper into this later in the presentation since it is one of the top findings for FY22, but I do feel like it is important to review it briefly before we get into the top findings. So administrative capability is the term used to refer to an institution's ability to comply with the laws and regulations governing the Title IV student aid programs. I'm sure this isn't new information for anyone here, but just a friendly reminder that it is not just a financial aid responsibility, but an institutional responsibility to remain in compliance. Here on the screen, we did put the link to the regulations 34 CFR 668.16 for you to view in depth the requirements by the Department of Education. And throughout the presentation, you'll see the regulations on most screens for you to refer to. The purpose of administrative capability is to show that the institution is administratively capable to participate in Title IV programs. And here at the bottom of you can see the link where most of our information from today came from. So if you haven't already looked at this or downloaded it, there it is for you. Over here on the left of the screen are the top 10 program review findings in order according to the Department of Education for FY22. So number 1, student status, referring to enrollment reporting. Number 2, loan discharge. Number 3, return to Title IV calculation errors. Number 4, student credit balance deficiencies. Number 5, verification violations. Number 6, entrance and exit loan counseling. Number 7, inaccurate record keeping. Number 8, SAP, incomplete policy or not monitored. Number 9, lack of administrative capability, and 10, ineligible student, referring to the high school student. So before we get started, I do want to mention that we will be going into detail with these findings. So for those of you that are newer, you'll have a really good understanding of a little backstory on each of these findings. All right. So up first on our list is student status enrollment reporting. And this one had 64 findings in this category, or 8.8% of the findings. This is the most common finding that I do see with schools. And whether you are utilizing a third-party servicer or if you're just utilizing NSLDS, these are going to apply to you. It's really important to remember that even if you are using a third-party servicer for enrollment reporting, the school still has the primary responsibility here. So if errors keep occurring or they do occur with reporting, it still falls on the school to resolve. And I have had this happen to me multiple times. So just something to remember and be aware of here. The collection of enrollment data is essential to the department for many reasons, such as it ensures loan repayment dates are accurately based on the last date of attendance. It allows in-school deferments to be automatically granted using NSLDS enrollment data. It also provides vast amount of critical data about the effectiveness of Title IV aid programs, including completion data. Also, very important to remember that accurate enrollment information is a vital component of administering the Title IV student loan programs. So the information reported determines if the student is still considered in school, must be moved into repayment, or is eligible for an in-school deferment. And for students who are entering repayment, the out-of-school status effective date determines when that grace period begins and how soon a student must begin repaying loan funds. Also, it's important that I note that the department does monitor school reporting, and it does inform schools when they are late responding to their roster, or if we're not reporting at an acceptable level. And some reports that they do provide us are the enrollment reporting statistics. They send compliance notifications, late roster notifications, and enrollment reports. And these are tools that you can use to monitor and measure compliance. All right, findings under this category include inaccurate reporting of student enrollment status and effective dates, failure to report the last date of attendance, changes in the student enrollment status, inaccurate reporting of program level data, late reporting of specific student information, and late submission of an NSLDS roster file. And again, keep in mind that the department requires schools to report enrollment data to NSLDS at least every 60 days and respond within 15 days of the date that NSLDS sends the enrollment roster file to the school or its third-party servicer. And this requirement also applies to schools that report exclusively online. NSLDS does allow schools to set their rosters to be generated either weekly, every other week, monthly, or every other month. And so a school will not go more than 2 months without receiving a roster file from NSLDS, and therefore will not go more than 2 months without reporting enrollment information. Any errors identified and returned by NSLDS in an error acknowledgement file that you receive should be corrected and resubmitted within 10 days. So looking at this from an auditing perspective, the objective here is really to determine whether the institution is notifying the Department of Education of changes in student enrollment information at the campus level and program level in a timely and accurate manner. So I want to call your attention to some important things to pay attention to when you're doing enrollment reporting. First up is accuracy of reporting. So accurate campus and program level enrollment demonstrated by the school, is it consistent with what's reflected in NSLDS? That's an important one. Second is timely status change reporting, right? So enrollment status change, is that being made timely to NSLDS? And examples here are students that are going from full-time to 3/4 time, half-time to less than half-time, full-time to withdrawal status, or half-time to graduated. So we did talk about that the department does monitor school reporting, and it informs schools when they're late responding to their roster or if they're not reporting data at an acceptable level. So again, some of those reports that the department sends out to help with accurate reporting are the enrollment reporting statistics report, compliance notifications, late roster notifications, and enrollment reports. Something that I do think is important to mention is the status graduated, or G, and this is reserved for students who have completed a program of study. And withdrawn is for students who have withdrawn during a term or in a non-term program during a payment period. And these two statuses, getting them accurate is key to preventing errors because it is tricky on which one to use at times. Some other common errors when reporting is the improper reporting of program enrollment effective date. And ways to correct this per the NSLDS enrollment guide is to ensure that the program effective date is when the student's current program status first took effect. If the enrollment status has not changed, do not change this date. Improper reporting of the published program link. So again, per the NSLDS enrollment guide, the published program link should usually be reported in years instead of months, right? And improper reporting of months instead of years can cause that PPL in years to be too long, which in turn will negatively affect the student's maximum eligibility period. Improper reporting of the program begin date. So the program begin date is the date on which the student began attending the program. And this date shouldn't change based on a new term or interruption in enrollment at the same location. Improper enrollment history corrections. So just a note here that you cannot report an enrollment status of an X or a Z if an enrollment history for a student already exists, such as a code of an F, Q, H, A, or L. And then updating NSLDS without updating your enrollment reporting servicer. So per the enrollment reporting guide, the school reported data and servicer reported data must stay in sync. And so if the data is not also reported to the servicer after being reported to NSLDS, the school reported data could be overwritten when the servicer responds to the enrollment reporting roster files. So ways to correct findings in this area is number one, to really create a committee to review the following things. You're going to want to review Title IV students in a different variety of enrollment scenarios here. And this is going to help you mitigate any financial aid, audit, and compliance issues. Reviewing different situations that come up, such as unofficial withdrawals, retroactive withdrawals, students who may have graduated in the spring, the fall, or summer terms, and more. You're going to want to conduct regular and an internal review of your federal aid students' enrollment reporting. And you can work with your committee on this, establishing strong policies and procedures around enrollment reporting to help stay in compliance. Utilize those following reports to measure compliance within enrollment reporting. We mentioned these above, but here they are again: enrollment reporting statistics, compliance notifications, the late roster notifications, and enrollment reports. You're going to want to certify all students on the enrollment roster at least every 60 days, even if there's no change in the status. You'll want to ensure correct enrollment status is reported at both that campus level and that program level. So there's a report that you can request that I thought it would be helpful. It's called the Enrollment Reporting Graduated Withdrawn Campus Report, or it's called SCHEC1. And this report provides you with an extract of all the students have graduated and or withdrawn within a specified timeline. And you can use this report to cross-check these two statuses to make sure that you're using the correct one. There's also another one titled SCHEP4 that is Enrollment Reporting Graduated Withdrawn Program Report that shows you an extract of students in all certified programs with a program enrollment status of graduated or withdrawn within a specified time frame. You're going to want to work with your registrar's office or other offices involved to review the processes and reporting and add those dates to your financial aid operational calendar to ensure that you're meeting all of those dates that we talked about above. And lastly, NSLDS the NSLDS enrollment guide is a great tool to use here because it breaks down each section of enrollment reporting and gives you tips and some common errors and how you can stay compliant in this area for this finding. All right, so we have our first polling question. So which office handles the enrollment reporting at your institution? Is it the registrar's office, the Office of Financial Aid, both the registrar and financial aid, or not mentioned here?
All right, everyone, if you are here for CPE, please make sure you are answering the polling questions. Make sure your slides box is maximized, and then you will scroll down just a bit and hit submit. Make sure you are clicking submit after you make your selection, and we will keep this up for just a few more moments, and then we will continue. And Kristen, there is a question in there asking, can you repeat the second? So I wonder if it was that second bullet on that student status slide. We can definitely go back to it after this polling question.
Okay. All right.
All right, everyone, we'll give it just a few more moments. Make sure you're getting this polling question in. You'll make your selection on the screen and don't forget to hit submit.
Oh, okay. So the second report that I mentioned here while we're waiting on that is, let me get that for you. So we have the SCHEC1, and then the second report was the SCHEP4. And that's the one with the certified programs and in program enrollment there.
Thank you. All right, and we will go on to results. There you go.
All right. Okay, so it looks like the registrar's office is the main one for enrollment reporting. Okay. All right, so next up we have loan discharge. So this finding went from 5th place in FY 2021 to number 2 this year. This finding had 50 sightings or 6.8%. So the secretary discharges the borrower's obligation to repay a direct loan if the borrower did not complete the program of study for which the loan was made because the school at which the borrower was enrolled closed. So causing for this finding include when borrowers are enrolled at the time of a school's closure or withdrawals shortly before the closure receives direct loan discharges. So some things to note here are that borrowers permitted to apply for a direct loan discharge are those that were enrolled at the time of the school closure or withdrew within the 120 days before the school's closure, or who did so within the 180 days before the school's closure and loans were first dispersed prior or on or after July 1st of 2020, and they were unable to complete their program because of the school's closure. It's also important to note that the department also discharges a borrower's obligation to repay a direct loan if the school falsely certifies the student's or parent's eligibility to receive the loan. And again, we put the reference to the regs at the bottom of the screen so you can refer back to it in more detail. All right, number 3 on our list is the return to Title IV calculation errors. And this finding seems to stay in the top audit findings due to the complexity of it. So return to Title IV calculation errors came in with 44 findings or 6%. And so we're going to go over the main points that causes the errors here. So findings under this category can include incorrect number of days used in a term and a payment period, incorrect clock hours used in a payment period, incorrect withdrawal date, incorrect aid used as could have been dispersed, incorrect post-withdrawal disbursement, mathematical and rounding errors, and the incomplete return to Title IV policy. So the first thing I want to briefly go over is the dispersed versus the could have been dispersed, because this is a common error. So a little background on this is the amount of Title IV assistance earned by the student is calculated by determining the percentage of Title IV grant or loan assistance that has been earned by the student and applying that percentage to the total amount of Title IV grant or loan assistance that was dispersed and that could have been dispersed to the student or on the student's behalf for the payment period or the period of enrollment as the student's withdrawal date. Okay, so going into some examples of the errors in detail are the inaccurate information. So aid dispersed and could have been dispersed. Make sure to remember that federal work study is not a could have been dispersed or dispersed. So for example, in the regulations cited 34 CFR 668.22, these do not apply to federal work study funds. So therefore, the R2T4 requirements do not apply to a student if the only Title IV aid the student has received or could have received was federal work study funds. Percentage of Title IV aid earned, term dates, scheduled breaks, actual clock hours versus scheduled clock hours. And so an example here would be that maybe a school used hours attended instead of scheduled hours to determine the percentage of the period completed in that step 2 of the calculation. Number 3 is the amount of unearned aid due to the school. So looking at institutional charges here. So an example here is institutional charges assessed for the entire period prior to the student's withdrawal. And then rounding. So more information about rounding is in volume 5, chapter 1 of the FSA handbook, but you want to enter dollars and cents using the standard rounding rules to round to the nearest penny. And final repayment amounts that the school and student are each responsible for returning any of the post-withdrawal disbursements may be rounded to the nearest dollar, except there is an exception there. Those disbursements may not be rounded up if such rounding would cause the amount disbursed to exceed the student's annual or aggregate award limit, including the Pell Grant lifetime eligibility, right? So that's an important one there. Percentages are used to calculate it to 4 decimal points and rounded to that 3 decimal places. And then the return to Title IV Consumer Information Policy is not being updated correctly. And then remember that this is a very common policy that the Department of Ed will request when they're doing their review for your recertification. So this one's a very important one to keep up to date. There is a lot to digest here with return to Title IV. So now we will look at all the corrective actions that you can put in place. All right. So first up is create policies and procedures. Review your return to Title IV consumer information policy, because again, we talked about in the consumer information, a school must make available to prospective and enrolled students upon request a statement of any refund policy in which the school must comply, the requirements for the treatment of Title IV funds when a student withdraws, and the requirements and procedures for officially withdrawing from the school. Also note that schools should provide sufficient information for a student or prospective students to determine the procedures for withdrawing and the financial consequences of doing so. And so the student should be able to estimate how much Title IV aid the student will keep and how much the student may have to return when they withdraw. You're going to want to train staff adequately on the return to Title IV process, including the dates to use in the calculations, the correct withdrawal dates, and using the correct amounts in the calculation. You want to review this process and include everyone who's involved in the process. And you want to work to document this process and put it in your policies and procedures manual for reference so that your staff can go back. And it's also a good idea to put an example of the calculation so that there is that reference point for your staff to go back to. Create a specific R2T4 second review process and include all who's going to be involved. So in the second review process, make sure that you're reviewing the calculations often and double checking for any errors that need correcting. So maybe this is having a second check of the last date of attendance that is used, the enrollment level at the time of withdrawing, and having them initial or sign off showing that they confirm that those dates are accurate when doing the second review process. All right, we're now up for our second poll question, and we would like to know, do you currently have a second review process in place for R2T4? Yes, we are working on implementing one and not sure where to start with the process.
All right, everyone, our second polling question is up. Make sure you are answering the polling question right on the screen, and then make sure you are clicking submit to submit your polling question, and make sure your slides box is maximized so you are able to see the polling question. We'll leave this up just for a few more moments and then we will continue. And Kristen, there is one Q&A question in the box.
Yes, thank you. I am going to respond to that question. It is asking about the loan forgiveness from the Biden administration. So I will, if we have time, we will get to that to the end, or I will respond via email. But that's a great question.
Sounds good. All right, everyone. Again, make sure you are answering the polling question that's up on the slides box. If you are here for CPE, make sure your slides box is maximized. Select your answer right on the screen and then hit submit. Alrighty, and we are ready for results.
All right. Okay, so it looks like overwhelmingly we have not sure where to start with the process. Okay, well, some good news here is that it does not have to be overly complicated to create a second review process with Return to Title IV, and that is definitely something that here in Eide Bailey we can help with, getting you started on putting those policies in place and getting everything situated for a very well second review process on Return to Title IV. So that is something we do and very familiar with. So if you would like some ideas there, we're happy to work with you on that. All right, moving on, we are talking about student credit balances. So here we go. So this is student credit balance deficiencies. This one had 38 findings were calculated under this category, or 5.2%. So a little background is when your school disperses Title IV program funds by crediting a student's account, and the total amount of all Title IV funds credited exceeds the amount of tuition and fees assessed to the student, it must pay the resulting credit balance as soon as possible, but no later than 14 days after the balance has occurred, right? And again, we have the regulations cited at the bottom here if you want to refer to them in detail. So some of the issues that fall under this category are notifications. So as we know, in general, there are two types of notifications that a school must provide. First is the general notification to parent plus loan borrowers and all students receiving federal funds, and a notice when direct loan funds or teach grant funds are credited to a student's account, okay? Next is the authorization form. So some things about this is the authorization form must be optional and should be simple and easy to understand. The student or parent borrower must have the option to cancel or modify the authorization at any time. Title IV credit balance funds retained on the basis of an authorization must be paid by the end of the last payment period in the award year for which they were awarded, or for loan funds by the end of that loan period. An exception does exist with this regulation. So if a student or a parent borrower has provided written authorization to the school to retain Title IV credit balance in order to assist the student in managing those funds for the remainder of the academic year. So that is an exception to this. Prior year charges. No more than $200 of a credit balance was retained for prior year charges. And then unclaimed credit balances. Make sure that these were processed correctly, and if necessary, they're returned to the Department of Education within 240 days, and all credit balances were released before the end of the loan period or the award year. And then lack of internal controls to manage the credit balance process. So some corrective actions to resolve these findings is you're going to want to start by reviewing the process with your controller or your business office, right? You want to set up monthly meetings to make sure that clear communication on the process and dates and deadlines are established. You're going to train and work with the staff in the business office to ensure that the process is clear to both offices here. You're going to take a look at your authorization form and ensure that your form is simple and easy to understand by the student. And if you need examples on this, a good place to start is looking at your state organizations, your regional organizations, or the FSA handbook does have an example in volume 4, chapter 2 that you can refer to and personalize it as needed. Then unclaimed credit balances. You may want to set up a shared spreadsheet with your of those students and parents that you need to reach out so they know about these unclaimed checks. So whether you're sharing a spreadsheet between the business office and your office so that you know when you're approaching that 240-day deadline and that you're keeping track of that so that you do not miss that deadline at all. And then establish detailed and clear policies on all the above by working with the business office and setting up those internal controls. It's very easy with this 240 deadline to miss that. So making sure that you have some mechanism in place that you're being made aware of that deadline and what needs to be done is vital for this category. All right. Verification violations. So this finding came up 34 times or 4.7%. So as we know, for every application that is selected for verification, the school must require the applicant to verify the information reported on the FAFSA. And then for each FAFSA application selected for verification, the department specifies the specific information that the applicant must verify. So findings in this category include verification documentation is missing or incomplete, inaccurate verification of selected applicants, missing verification policies, and interim disbursement rules are not being followed. So remember, and this is important, a school's failure to verify the information used to calculate its students' need for federal student aid may result in the students receiving more federal funds to which they are not entitled. In the 2021-22 year, the Department of Ed issued the waiver for schools to only verify the V4, V5, but this waiver did not free schools from reviewing and resolving conflicting data when it comes to determining student eligibility. So to view more information on this in the waiver, you can view the Dear Colleague letter changes to the 22-23 verification requirements. Now, ways to correct the errors on the verification violations. You're going to want to create a verification policy that outlines all of the steps required in verifying a student's file. And place this process in your policies manual or keep it handy for staff to refer to. Detailing it out step by step, providing examples is really handy for your staff to have different situations as well. You want to train your staff adequately on all the processes in verification, including how to handle ISER corrections and using the correct code on COD for verification. Create a second review process on verification and meet monthly to review the files for accuracy. So finding whether you create a select portion of folks on your staff who do the second review process on verification and then initial that they've signed off and everything is correct is also a good way to make sure that conflicting data is handled and all the information matches. You're going to want to continue to monitor the process and enhance internal controls as needed, right? Looking at your system controls and internal processes regarding verification for this area. Exit and entrance counseling. This category had 33 findings or 4.5%. So findings in this category include late exit letter documentation was not sent to the student, not mailing exit counseling documents as required, and not maintaining documentation of loan counseling sent. So a little background here. Schools must ensure that entrance counseling is conducted with each direct loan borrower prior to making the first disbursement, unless the student has borrowed loans before. Schools must also ensure that exit counseling is conducted with each loan borrower shortly before the student borrower ceases at that less than half-time enrollment. And if a student borrower withdraws from all classes without the school's prior knowledge or fails to complete the exit counseling as required, exit counseling must be provided either through the interactive electronic means or by mailing written counseling materials to the student borrower at the student borrower's last known address within 30 days after it learns that the student borrower has withdrawn from the school or failed to complete the exit counseling as required. And as we know, FSA does provide an online student loan exit counseling option here. So ways to correct this finding, Review your processes surrounding return to Title IV, as well as reviewing those that have dropped before that less than half time or are on a graduation list, right? You're going to want to train your staff on the return to Title IV processes and unofficial withdrawal policies. And it's a really good idea here to develop a way to track the sending of the exit letters. So whether you're storing the exit letters in a secure electronic file, or they're on a shared drive, or you keep a spreadsheet, you're gonna wanna have a place to refer back to these as needed. Work with your IT office, your registration office to ensure that financial aid is on the list to receive notification when students are less than half time or are on a current graduation list. You're going to want to notify students to complete their online exit counseling. And then you're going to want to mail that direct loan link within 30 days of an unofficial withdrawal, or if they have not completed exit counseling, and documenting the date in the student's record. And then you're going to review the process monthly to ensure that students are not being missed. And again, have a second review process in place here to ensure that this requirement is not being missed. And it can be as simple as a spreadsheet that you have, and that your staff goes back and makes sure that these students were sent the letter. The letter is documented, it's in the student's file, and you have that date. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it is really important that you have a process here to track these exit and entrance counseling. All right. Incorrect record keeping. So this category reported 26 findings, or 3.6%. And there is a lot on this slide, so we will go through them one by one. But to start, institutions are expected to accurately and timely report disbursements and adjustments to the department within 15 days of making a disbursement or becoming aware of the need to adjust a previously reported disbursement. Okay? So findings under this category may include disbursement dates on the student ledgers do not match the disbursement dates reported in COD, and disbursement amounts on student ledgers do not match disbursement amounts reported in COD. Inaccurate and incomplete student account statements and ledgers. So in examples here are students not charged for courses, multiple transactions for single term course changes or charges, Title IV disbursements missing from ledgers. Inaccurate or missing federal work study program time sheets. Failure to reconcile Title IV accounts monthly. Failure to properly identify Title IV bank accounts. Excess cash, drawing down more Title IV funds than needed to disperse to students. Sending disbursement reports late to COD after that 15-day requirement. Excess cash held in excess of 3 business days before dispersing funds to students. Policies and procedures not created. Inaccurate audit trail of return of funds. The date on the ledger is earlier than the date funds returned to the department through G5. And information reported on the FIS app does not match the school's financial records. And late or unmade submission of disbursement records to COD. So that was a lot right there. And now we're going to talk about some corrective action and ways to mitigate this finding. So you're going to want to create a committee that reviews and makes sure that 15-day reporting requirement is met, and making sure that you have reports to review that this deadline is also being met. This is a very common thing that I see, is missing this 15-day reporting deadline. So whether you have reports after you disperse, making sure you catch loans that may be stuck and not making it up to COD, these are just some ways to catch these so that you're ensuring you're making these 15 days requirement. Policies and procedures should be created and include how to reconcile COD amounts to student ledger accounts. You're going to want to review student account ledgers and ensure that the aid isn't clearly identified on those ledgers. Another thing is to avoid the excess cash. Draw down funds to G5 or G6 after funds have been dispersed to students. You're going to want to work with the business office staff to train on all of the above issues and then document that policy for reference. Work together on a reconciliation process and meet at least monthly to review the reconciliation to ensure that it's being performed correctly. So whether that looks like financial aid reconciles their part and the business office does theirs, and then you compare numbers and see what's off, it's a good idea to have that clear communication here between the offices, and it just makes things easier in the long run. Create a second review process on all the above issues and review them often for accuracy. You're going to work to create a federal work study process that addresses specific timelines and review of the timesheets and involve all of those who are involved with the processing of federal work study. So if that's the HR department or payroll or whoever, but making sure that you have somebody who's reviewing those timesheets for accuracy along with financial aid. Create strong internal controls for reviewing the information that's entered on the FIS app. So here this is another idea, is to have a second review process to confirm those amounts before submitting. And you'll want to keep very detailed records here and save all the documentation that you use for the FIS app for reference. And call everybody together who's involved and make sure that you double check those numbers and that they do add up. Identify the balance for each FSA program that is included in the school's bank account as readily as if those funds were in a separate account. And identify earnings on FSA program funds in the school's bank account. Okay, so letting the feds know there are Title IV funds in this account. All right, now we are going to talk about SAP. So this category here resulted in 25 findings, or 3.4% of the findings. This findings include paying students that are ineligible. And so this type of SAP finding will result if the school disperses Title IV aid without regard for the student's SAP status. Incorrect SAP calculations. This finding may result when a school fails to perform SAP assessments in alignment with the end of the Title IV payment periods. Other issues could include a school's failure to include courses dropped by a student. So after any of the drop add period ends, as attempted credits. Missing SAP documentation. So this finding results when the school fails to document that it has completed a SAP assessment for a student, and pieces of the policy are incorrect or missing. And a SAP policy may be incorrect or missing if certain pieces are not included. Such things that need to be included are qualitative component, the pace of completion, maximum time frame, and how a student can regain eligibility for aid. The result of not meeting SAP, and how a student can regain that eligibility back. How the school treats things such as an incomplete, withdrawals, repeat courses, transfer credits. So all of these need to be included in your SAP policy. And again, this is another policy that's very common for the feds to request when it's time for recertification. So to help mitigate these findings, you're going to start with creating and reviewing your SAP procedures. And make sure that they mirror the ones that are on your website as well. Because again, it's a very popular one for the Department of Ed to pull and review. Be sure to review your SAP statuses often to catch any errors, so you can spot check SAP statuses to ensure the correct status is applied. You're going to want to obtain SAP appeal documentation and keep that with the student file. So make sure you have all the documentation that you need to make a determination, and then you can show why that appeal was approved or denied. And if your school utilizes a SAP committee that reviews appeals, make sure you keep all of that documentation there as well. I've been a part of schools that we've had virtual SAP committees, and so we've had to keep all of the emails in one place for documentation and document the decision that way. So have a really good process there to make sure you keep all the information that you use. Review disbursement reports to spot check SAP statuses before paying. Create specific reports to check on students with incorrect SAP statuses. So whether you create reports that come after you've dispersed that review, and you can double check that those SAP statuses are good before paying. I know most of our systems are set up to catch this. But for those of us who've been in financial aid for a while, we know that sometimes that doesn't always work. So making sure that we have a way to review those is a really good idea. All right, we are up for our third polling question. And it is, how often do you run SAP at your institution? At the end of each payment period, annually, or other?
All right, everyone, our third polling question is up. If you are here for CPE, please make sure you are answering these polling questions that appear. Make sure your slides box is maximized. You will make your selection right on the screen and then hit submit. And also the PowerPoint handout link is located in your related content box. It does say PowerPoint handout link. Go ahead and click on that and you'll be able to download the PowerPoint.
Thank you. And just a couple questions here. IHE is Institutions of Higher Education. That is what that stands for. And can you repeat the suggested second review process checkpoints? Yes, I will review those at the end if we have time. If not, I will definitely get in touch with you and go over those.
Okay, and we have results up.
Okay, so we show here that 53.9% run SAP at other times. All right, moving into lack of administrative capability. So this category was reported having 19 findings, or 2.6%. And we briefly touched on this at the beginning of the presentation. However, this did show up as a top 10 finding. And as a reminder here, to begin and continue to participate in any Title IV HEA program, a school must demonstrate to the secretary that it is capable of adequately administering the program. And this findings may happen when a school has significant findings that question its ability to administer Title IV aid, right? So there's a lot on this screen, so we're going to go through it quickly. But findings in this category can include a failure to do the following: a failure to designate a capable individual, inadequate number of persons to be responsible for administrating Title IV programs, failure to communicate to the individual responsible for administrating the Title IV programs all information received by an institutional official that bears on a student's eligibility, failure to develop written procedures regarding the administration of Title IV programs, failure to establish a system of internal controls that includes adequate checks and balances, failure to divide the functions of authorizing payments and dispersing or delivering funds so that no one office has responsibility for both, failure to establish and maintain required records, failure to establish, publish, and apply reasonable standards for measuring whether a student is maintaining satisfactory academic progress, failure to develop and apply an adequate system to identify and resolve discrepancies in the information received with respect to a student's application for federal aid, failure to provide adequate financial aid counseling to eligible students, failure to provide all program and fiscal reports and financial statements required for compliance, and failure to develop and follow procedures to evaluate the validity of a student's high school completion. So that was a lot there. So ways to address this finding is that the Department of Education does not specify exactly what an adequate number of staffing to administer Title IV, but they do provide guidelines to determine if you do have enough staff. And so things to consider here are the number and types of programs the school participates in, the number of FAFSA applications that are reviewed, number and amount of students who receive funds and the amounts, the systems used by financial aid, the degree of automation a school uses, number and distribution of financial aid staff, and the use of any third-party servicers used in the administration of Title IV. You're going to want to work with offices that may have knowledge of conflicting student information and set up a process to be able to communicate that information to the financial aid office. Written procedures should include the responsibilities of various offices that approve or disperse the delivery of Title IV aid. And make sure you include these in your policies and procedures manual and outline them very clearly. You're going to want to set internal controls, both system-wide and policy-wide, on checks and balances to ensure compliance. And you're going to want to identify your checks and balances in your policies and procedures manual as well. Work to develop your SAP policy and document that SAP policy containing all of the required information that we discussed earlier in this presentation. A reminder here is to make sure this policy matches the policy on your website as well. You'll want to create a committee along with a second review process for resolving any discrepancies that the school receives that could change the eligibility in Eide, right? So document this policy in your policies and procedures manual in detail. Review your reports to make sure that you're receiving all of the information to review what's in these students' files for discrepancies. Some schools have a thing called an ICER discrepancy type of report to help them show the difference between ICERs to make identifying discrepancies for financial aid staff easier to find. Review all of the counseling that you are providing to students to ensure that you are not missing any that are required by the department. And then the high school completion, we're going to discuss on the next slide coming up here. All right, and here we have it. So this category resulted in 17 findings, or 2.3%, the ineligible student or high school student. So as we know, schools must develop and follow procedures to evaluate the validity of a student's high school completion. So if the institution has any reason to believe that the high school diploma is not valid, or it was not obtained from an entity that provides secondary school education, then the school has to validate and figure out if the student is eligible. So the Department of Education has stated that they have identified several instances where schools have improperly relied upon invalid credentials issued by high school diploma mills in an attempt to establish a student's eligibility to receive Title IV program funds. So students who lack a high school diploma or who have not otherwise demonstrated their ability to benefit from a program of post-secondary training are not usually eligible to receive Title IV aid. All right. So ways to mitigate this finding are to work with your admissions office to develop procedures for checking the validity of a student's high school completion. So procedures here may include on how to check with the high school to confirm if it's valid, or confirming validity with the relevant department or agency in the state. And if you want more information on this specifically, it's found in detail in Volume 1 of Chapter 1 of the FSA Handbook. You're going to want to train your staff adequately on what is acceptable form of documentation and provide them with updated procedures on how to check the validity of the high school diploma. And then again, a second review process is not a bad idea here on files to ensure accuracy with this finding. All right, so I do want to talk about repeat findings. And so repeat findings is the failure to take corrective action, and it is the #1 compliance audit finding. And this shows that schools are not resolving prior year findings, or they're having the same issues year to year and are unable to find a solution to address the internal control over the process or the system. So just some ways to avoid repeat findings is document all of your policies and procedures extensively. Remember that your policies should really describe the how, the why, and the what. And then also detailing all this out. And if you have a hit by the bus or a win the lottery manual, that's more of a technical reference so that you can show step by step how you're going to implement that process. Training of staff. Making sure that all staff is involved and trained on these processes, right? Work with them thoroughly on all process and making sure they understand the entire process. You're going to want to reduce the need of questions on student files. So making sure that you have all the documents related to the student file is there. And this goes back to the SAP documentation we talked about and the verification violations. Doing a file review is always a good practice with ensuring that there's no missing items in these student files. You're going to want to create strong internal controls to prevent findings. So checking and making sure that all systems are set up correctly, and try to mitigate human error with implementing that second reviewer process that we talked about. I strongly recommend a second review process on all the main areas of Title IV. just because a good second set of eyes does come in very handy to catch errors. And if it was just a one-off mistake, how do we prevent this from happening again? And then lastly is the corrective action plan. So things to consider when you are writing your correction action plan here is looking at what caused the issue to happen in the first place, right? Was it human error, or was it just a one-off? A system process that maybe was set up wrong, or a broken internal controls, or lack of internal controls. So finding that root cause is a really good starting point to resolving the issue. Then look and see, is this a reoccurring issue, or is this a new issue? If it's a new issue, what caused it? And maybe it's a new policy or a new procedure to your office, and more training is needed on that specific subject. If it's reoccurring, are the internal controls in place, and are they being followed? Identifying where the issue happened at, right? Was it outside of the financial aid office, or was it internal? And if it was outside of the financial aid office, so some examples here would be like the consumer information, crime awareness statistics, the bank accounts without federal funds applied, are the internal controls in proper place? So looking to see if everything's okay there. Are weekly and monthly meetings in place along with a second review process? The timing of the issue. Is it too late to correct? Can you correct it before the next audit? And if not, can you place the proper controls in motion so that you can prevent this further error from happening? And then reviewing your internal controls to make sure they are doing what they need to do. Do you need to review your reports or pull more information so that you can review more eligibility as needed? And then when you're really writing your CAP as needed, remember that this is an opportunity for you to work up with coming up with a plan so that this finding doesn't happen in the next upcoming audit. So really focusing on trying to find the main cause on why the finding occurred is the key to really placing those internal controls in place to prevent these findings from happening. And one piece of advice from me is to just really involve the correct individuals to help address the findings so that you can prevent them in the future. And make sure that you are very clear and detailed when you're writing your corrective action plan so that the Department of Ed knows exactly how you're going to resolve these findings and what policies and measures are you creating so that this doesn't come up in upcoming years. All right. Well, these on the screen right now are services that Eide Bailey can provide. And we will look at questions now. I do appreciate everybody's time and thank you for attending our webinar on the top 10 program review findings. We do have an upcoming webinar on September 12th where we will go over the 2023 compliance supplement and what that means to federal student aid. So I hope that you all will attend. And for our last polling question, would you like for a member of our team to reach out after the webinar?
Alrighty, we have a final polling question up right now. For those who are, if you're looking at your earned certification box, if you've met your CPE requirements, you are able to view and download your certificate right from there. Remember, if you are Eide Bailey staff, please ignore that downloading of your certificate and your certificate will automatically be granted in the Learning Center. And then you also have access to the PowerPoint handout. It's in the related content box. It does say PowerPoint handout link. Go ahead and click on that and you are able to download today's PowerPoint. And if you have any final questions, you can definitely place them in the Q&A box and we can definitely pull a report for Kristen and she will be able to send you responses.
All right. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, thank you for everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Kristen, for this awesome webinar and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.